when we talk about culture, what does that mean? Here's the Lalu culture model. This is a super simplified version of the model. If you want to see the full version, you can read the entire book. What he does is that he divides up culture into various levels that he all gives a color to. And here are some of them: red, orange, green, and teal. So red is the lowest one. So red is the culture based on power. Think of the mafia or a wolf pack, where beating someone else up gets you what you want. Orange is the predominant culture of our time. So think of a corporation. This is the culture of metrics or money. So the one who has the most money wins. The goal of a corporation is to make the most money. Green, the metaphor is a family, right? So we do what's good for the family. So let's say that I'm at the dinner table and there's a chocolate cake. So if I were in a red culture and I like chocolate cake, I beat everyone else up and I eat the chocolate cake for myself. But in a green culture, everyone matters. So all of the stakeholders matters, the entire family matters. So I share the chocolate cake. It's not just all about me. And so I share things with myself, with the economy, with employees, with the environment, with the government, okay, with all stakeholders. So that's green. And finally, teal is everything as an ecosystem, mutually supporting each other. So as Francisco Varela, a Chilean philosopher, said, when a living system is suffering from ill health, the remedy is found by connecting with more of itself, okay? So an example of that you see here, which is an anthill. So an anthill is a very interesting thing. So for those of you who have a background in project management, how many project managers does it take to build an anthill? And the answer is none. There are no project managers in an anthill colony. And the question is, how is it that they do that? Well, the answer is that they do it by having a teal culture, right? A culture which is completely connected to itself and has evolved in such a way that each ant is perfectly suited to its purpose, okay? Each ant is perfectly suited to its purpose. And so they're living in perfect harmony and things are in perfect balance, okay? So that is the highest level of culture in the Lalu culture model. And so if you jump onto this, and I see a total of 7 people are on this, so if you jump onto this, where's your organization? I'm just showing you here the Budweiser Zero. This is a 0-calorie Budweiser. So that's what we don't want to be at, right? We don't want to be at a 0-calorie culture, right? We want a culture that is supporting us. So just come over here and pick a sticky. So the sticky is the thing that's down here. I'm glad that someone is able to move the Budweiser culture. So the sticky is right here. So just click on the sticky, pick a yellow sticky, and then click on over here and just type in what is the predominant culture of where you are now, the predominant culture, right? So that would be red, orange, green, or teal. Let's go ahead and type in what the predominant culture is of your organization today, of the part that you see. So one person has typed in orange. That's the most common culture of corporations today, so that would probably be the default. Another person has typed in orange. Another person, orange, green. Orange, green. Orange, fantastic. Now, let me ask you, where does your organization want to be? So if you go to the next area, type in, where does your organization want to be? Okay, one person says green, another person says green, one person says green. And let me ask Katrina, are breakout rooms enabled, or are we going to do the conversation in this room?
Unfortunately, there's no access to the breakout rooms for this session.
Great, so we'll just have the conversation here. That's perfect. Okay, great. Now, I'm going to give you just an insightful comment here, followed by an insightful question, which I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself and have this conversation in a group, okay? So the insightful comment is that in a hierarchical organization, right, one which has that typical pattern of people reporting to people, reporting to people, reporting to people with one person at the top, the CEO, the organization can really only be as evolved as its leader. So if you have a red leader, you're going to have a mostly red organization. You might have some pockets of orange, green, even teal, but you're going to have a mostly red organization. So if you are in an orange organization, that means you have mostly orange leaders. And if you're trying to evolve into a green organization, that means that these orange leaders have to evolve into a green organization. So leadership means that they're trying to evolve faster than the organization and become green leaders. And so here's the question for you. Are leaders growing faster than the organization? So that's the discussion question. So I'm just going to stop sharing here. I'm going to invite you to unmute, and I'm going to invite you to have that conversation amongst yourselves. So are leaders in your organization evolving their leadership style and evolving their personal ability to lead culture faster than the organization itself? Go ahead and have that discussion.
I could throw something out there to start that just to kind of hopefully get things going. For where I work, I think there's a lot of talk that there's a lot of leaders that believe they do, and then they talk about changing things, but I don't think necessarily actions often support what the direction is that they might discuss that they want to go. It comes much more slowly than they're willing to talk about it.
Yeah, I find the same thing. Also, I think they're hampered by the fact they will behave as their direct boss wants them to behave, who will behave as their direct boss wants them to behave. So it's sort of a very pyramid structure, which kind of constrains people from developing and growing, because then the budget comes into play as well.
So that's interesting. So I work for a large organization, and I think from what I've noticed, the people at the very top tend to be more green, blue, right? And then folks a little bit lower on the pyramid, maybe it's because they're concerned more with day-to-day operating the business. They tend to be more, I would say orange, what is it, orange, blue? I don't know if that's because of the concerns of operating the business or because those more inclusive kind of visionary leaders have risen to the top. I'm not sure.
Yeah, for me, I'm still trying to figure things out. I actually just started at the company like 4 or 5 days ago, but it definitely feels like a red organization. And I'm not really sure if the CEO is open to change or evolving the culture, but I guess I'll find out in the upcoming weeks and months.
Hi, so my name is Ed Rowand, and I just want to say that I kind of agree with the guy right before the last guy. Our top leadership seemed to kind of get it. The middle management, not so much. But the other thing I've seen too is even as they start to try to transform, if there's any really severe external pressures, that they tend to revert to what they know and kind of downshift back into well, those uglier colors.
I wonder if the challenge is because people are afraid to report. I'm not going to say failure, but things to learn. This one didn't get quite right. We're adjusting to self-correct. People are too keen to muddy the way they report upwards with fluffy, lovely sounding words, which hides the true facts sometimes.
Hi, Peter here from the Netherlands. I think it's a good question. I think our management, our leader, he is indeed willing to go faster than the organization, but he's also dealing with the people below him and getting stuck, getting trapped in the actual mindset, cultural mindset, I should say. And it's not that easy to move. You know, you're dealing with a lot of operational managers. They love Excel, and if you're talking agile, that's a very difficult topic.
You know, thinking more about this, in my large organization, one of the ways that you get noticed and move up is by kind of building an area or taking over an area and growing it, which I guess is what, like the orange, kind of orange red, right? It's about the power and growing the profitability of that area. But then once you get towards the very top, it's more about kind of bringing everybody underneath you into the fold in order to move people.
So I think in a corporate environment, the external forces and pressures on the money motive also impact, even if the leaders are expressing sort of a green, even teal sentiment, because they really want that, they end up coming under this sort of extreme pressure, and some of that pressure and it comes into a conflicting message that flows down to those middle managers. Like, we want you to be green teal, but we still want you to deliver. We still want you to make that money. And then the same thing happens to those middle managers. They're trying to embrace green teal kind of agile mindsets with their teams. But again, I think somebody said earlier, when the pressure hits and something goes wrong, they're going to start to revert back as a result of that unhealthy thing that's driving them.
Ian, I definitely think that this is the trend of things right now, but do you think the market, quote unquote, at large, investors and customers, do you think they're at the point where they're rewarding a more inclusive managerial style and companies that are more inclusive, such that those things don't have to be in conflict?
Yeah, I think underlying it is that the green and teal organizations are actually starting to show that they can do much better, right? Mm-hmm. With those kind of cultures, you're going to get much better results, but it takes time. And I think a lot of the the so-called driven from the street kind of thinking is very short-term and tactical. And I think that's where that problem exists, that you don't have the time to get to green and teal and show that you can have this amazing growth.
The other thing that I've seen in my organizations, which blends a little bit of those last two thoughts of some of the things that are happening, is sometimes when instruction is to move in the direction of the green and teal, though, what I've seen also is then you inject, or a new person comes in, if they are much more of a red instinct, they overtake that area and kill what was happening because they're trying to put their piece on it, back to the earlier point about trying to show that they need to move up. And so it's another way that it just hinders that ultimately. And then the weird thing is it's not the market, but sometimes then those people are rewarded, even though they're exhibiting to grow their own career, the exact opposite of what is the desired behavior. They're applauded for it for growing. They don't really look at it as much from the higher leadership standpoint about how they came in and kind of crushed the rest of the collaborative that was occurring.
Right, it's a question of what is the organization measuring, right? If it's measuring sales goals and quotas and client acquisition, right? If you destroy culture to get there, that's a problem. Yes.
Yeah. In my experience, what I have seen, this is Sam, folks, is that like I've seen like layers of the culture. Maybe like the top management is all red, right? And then as you go down, if you look into the ground level, it's like full teal, I guess. And whenever like those deals where like those deals, those cultures, those teams, the way they kind of interact, they're kind of oblivious of what's happening up. And only things when get escalated, the red overcomes the teal. So it's like, fascinating with the colors.
Thank you for that conversation. I'll tell you a story. I was once at a presentation with a famous Agile coach by the name of Michael Spade, and he said, open to questions. And someone said, what happens if I'm in an organization in which my leader is red and I'd like him to change? What can I do to make him change? And Spade said, well, you can wait for him to die. And of course, everyone laughed. And he said, no, I'm actually serious. You can't make anyone change. And maybe that's the most important thing. Maybe that's the most important thing in life. The amount of relief that we would all experience if we realize that we can't make other people change, but particularly in the corporate world. The idea that we can make people change, in particular leaders change, it's always just an invitation, right? We can't make other people change. They have to want to change themselves, right? We can invite change, but we can't make other people change. Like there aren't like tricky ways to influence people or to persuade people or like stuff like that. People have to want to change. If they don't want to change, that's it. He also said, if someone wants to change, right, the fastest way to do it was through meditation. And if you had like a really aggressive program of meditation, you could do it in 2 to 5 years. Okay? So shifting culture in an organization is not fast, right? It's not going to fit into a 3-month quarterly earnings report. So let's move on. But step number one, insight number one, is that an organization is only as evolved as its leaders. So here's insight number 2. What structures or practices are possible in an organization? Well, the answer is not any. It also doesn't depend on how much training you've given, although it does depend somewhat on it. It also doesn't depend on who your Agile coach or Scrum Master is. It also doesn't really depend, although it does depend, on how mature the organization is. What it depends on most critically is the culture of the organization. And this is the part that people completely miss. That's why I'm emphasizing this, right? So it does depend on all these other things, like the experience of the organization, who the coaches are, all that other stuff. But people already know that, right? People already know to look for that, to evaluate that, to think about that. The thing that people don't know to look for is the culture of the organization. So very, very often people are trying to implement practices that do not fit the culture of the organization. And so they don't look for culture/practices fit. And so the practice fails and they blame the manager or they blame the coach or they blame the training and they say, we need more training. People just haven't been trained. Or they say, oh, the management is not right and we need to go fix middle management. When in fact, the problem is that the culture is not appropriate. And so here's the relationship between culture and practices. So if you have a red culture, only a very narrow set of practices is possible. If you have an orange culture, you can do all of the red practices plus the orange practices. If you have a green culture, you can do all of the red practices plus the orange practices plus the green practices. And if you have a teal culture, you can do all of them. Now, sometimes red practices are appropriate practices. Sometimes orange practices are appropriate practices. Sometimes green, right? The thing to do is to choose the appropriate ones. The big mistake that corporations make is to try to do things that are outside of their culture. And what's the biggest mistake they make? The biggest mistake they make is that since most corporations today are orange, right? And when we think of agile culture is green teal. many Agile practices are green teal. And so you take an orange culture and you implement an Agile green teal practice and it blows up. So here's one really simple one. Some of you might be familiar with Agile Games, just like the idea of playing games to learn Agile ideas. And so one common reaction you might hear in staid corporate environments, this happens less and less, but still happens, is we're not going to bring in games because games are not serious, right? So that's a cultural issue. That's a cultural issue that's occurring when you hear that. Let's do something much simpler. You bring in the daily scrum or a daily stand-up into a red culture, right? Which is about power, right? They don't care about transparency. They don't care about self-organizing systems, self-organizing teams, like the manifesto says. They care about is power, right? So the stand-up practice is not going to work too well. Saying I have an impediment is not going to work too well. Asking for help is not going to work too well. So the practices have to be appropriate for the culture. And so, simple question here. If we are an orange corporation that wants to adopt a green Agile practice, we ask, does the organization want to shift to green culture? The answer could be no, right? The answer could be no, in which case we can only adopt orange practices, right? No means no. No doesn't mean yes. It means no. So we can only adopt orange practices. And we have to be humble and realistic. One of the biggest mistakes that Agilists make is to keep pounding their heads and thinking that they can change things when there's an actual no, right? That's actually not being respectful. When someone has said no and you keep disagreeing with them, you're not hearing their no. So they could say no. Now, if they say yes, what we've just learned from insight number one is that leaders have to go first. And so now we need to go to the leaders and ask them, are they interested in shifting? And I'll be sharing about how to do that next. If they say yes, then the leaders need to shift. And then as the leaders shift their leadership, then the organization will shift. And then at the very end, we can implement the green practices. So you will notice that that is not what the vast majority of Agile transformations do, right? The vast majority of Agile transformations look like, let's do team training around practices first, not let's go to leadership and ask them, are they interested in shifting their leadership styles? Right? So that's why we're talking about culture first Agile transformations. And this is what's required for Agile transformations to be successful of this sort. If you simply want to stay inside of orange and make it 10% better, then what you need to do is you need to find orange practices that are 10% better than the ones that your organization is currently implementing. But if you want to have a transformation, and for me, transformation means shifting culture. That's what transformation means. Otherwise, it's just an adoption. Not just an adoption, it's an adoption of Agile practices that are better than the practices currently in an organization, giving you a 10% better result. If you want a transformation, that means culture shift, and culture shift requires as a prerequisite leadership shift. So it starts there. You get the leadership shift, then you get the culture shift, then you get the practices shift, which is almost always the exact opposite of what most organizations start with. And why is that? Because practices are what you see when you look at an organization, and teams are a lot easier to start with than leaders. Okay, so that's insight number two, is that you have to have culture practices fit. And now that you see this, you can probably just go into an organization and with X-ray vision you can say, oh, that's why this practice doesn't work, because it doesn't have the right culture to support, the organization doesn't have the right culture to support this practice. Okay, so let's go ahead and answer this simple question. Okay, does the Agile structure work given the culture? So just go ahead and sticky note some structure that you know about, right? They can be some Scrum structure that everyone knows about, like the sprint planning meetings. It can be some other structure that you know about, from SAFe, from LESS, any structure that you know about. And then pick a culture, right? Red, orange, green, teal, and write about whether or not it actually works in that particular structure. So pick a structure or practice, pick a culture, and then write about whether or not it works in that particular. Okay, fantastic. Someone even likes Scrum. Okay, now the final question we're going to ask is, let's say you're getting yes, 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 yes to everything. So that means that leaders want to shift their behavior and their cultural style. How do you do that, right? So a leader says, yep, I'm orange. I want to shift to green. How do you do that? There are several tools to do that. One of them is called the Marquet Leadership Ladder. This was developed by David Marquet. Marquet is the way it's pronounced. Sorry about that. Not Marquet, Marquet. Turn the ship around.
Yeah, I believe it is Marquet.
It is Marquet?
It is.
Oh, I don't think so.
That's how he says it. So
Is that how he says it? All right. Okay. Thank you so much for the correction. And turn the ship around. There's a very nice video online. I strongly encourage you to say very nice online site as well, doing very innovative things. So he was a Navy captain, and it was a terrible, terrible ship, and he turned the ship around. And so he has this ladder of leadership. The first one is what the boss says. The second one is what the team member says. So at level of leadership number 1, the lowest level of leadership, the boss says, do this. The team member says, tell me what to do. Level 2, the leader says, what do you see? Team member says, I see. Level 3 says, what do you think? Team member says, I think. Level 4, what would you like to do? I would like to. What do you intend to do? I intend to. What have you done? I have. What have you been doing? I've been doing. Okay, so we're going from red to teal. You can think about it, right? There's a different ladder, so it's not exactly the same thing as Lalu, but that's roughly the mapping. And so you can then use this as a tool with leaders and with yourself. Number 1, just be aware. That's always the way I suggest starting, right? One of my teachers says awareness is 67.8% of change. So don't try to change at the start. Just be aware of where you are. Just observe your behavior for a week and say, oh, 50% of the time I'm at L4, 30% of the time I'm at L1, 20% of the time I'm at L2. Okay. And then just start testing. Oh, look, when I speak to this person, I'm typically at L1. Instead of telling that person do this, let me try L2 this time. See how it feels. See what it's like. See what happens. Okay. Let me try L3. Let me try L4. Don't like it? Let me go back to L3, L2. Okay. Let me become fluent in L1 through L7. I stress that the goal isn't to be at L7 all of the time. The goal is to be fluent in all of them and choose the best one, right? If we're in a crowded movie theater, not going to happen for a while, but if we were in a crowded movie theater and if there's a fire, we don't want a conversation around L5. What do you intend to do? What do you intend to do, right? We want the person who knows where the exit to be operating at the L1, say, do this, right? So it's about the appropriate level of leadership, right? But what we don't want is for someone who's constantly at L1, right? That's not appropriate. Well, probably not appropriate, right? So what we want is fluency across, which for, say, an orange organization will probably tend to move people up towards green, right? Okay, so as people start moving up, organization becomes more green. And I'll notice that there's a dual responsibility, team member and manager, right? So when someone says, what do you think? It's the responsibility of the team member to be able to answer that question. And so there might be some mentoring involved in that. Oh, I expect you to also be thoughtful about the work that you're doing in addition to doing the work. Okay, so this is a tool that can be just shared with all of management. to make them aware of what level they're operating in. Okay, so just to recap the 3 insights. Okay, so insight number 1 is that the agility of an organization, the culture of an organization is capped by the leader. So the leaders need to be growing faster than the organization is going to grow. The second insight is that there needs to be culture practices fit. And the number one secret reason, the number one reason that people don't know about that practices fail is because the practices are not supported by the culture. Okay, and then number 3, third insight, is that once you have yeses to everything, so yes, we want to shift culture. Yes, leaders go first. Yes, we have the appropriate culture fit. Okay, then this is a tool, and there are other tools to actually shift the leadership style. Okay, so with that, I'm happy to take questions, conversations, disagreements.
Michael, I'm interested in your thoughts on if it's possible to see different cultures within one organization. So, you know, I see more success in certain parts of the org because they have a slightly more green culture than another part of the org which has a slightly more orange or red culture.
Yeah, so I learned a trivial technique from Michael Sahota from which a lot of this work is based on, which is you can just ask. So I was developing like this very complicated assessment to figure out, you know, whether an organization was orange or green or teal, and I was basing, you know, my behavior on that and my coaching on that. And he said, you can just ask the organization. You literally describe it the way I described it. You put up a big chart on a wall in front of 100 people, and I've done that before. And you just say, come up here and sticky note what you see in the organization.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't so much asking, you know, how to identify that. I feel okay with that. It's more about, do you see there's some advantage to, if you were trying to change the culture and you have a part of the organization which perhaps is more green, you know, helping or investing in that part of the organization to help kind of drive the rest of the organization. Have you seen any kind of success there?
Invest in the higher culture, invest in the lower culture.
Yeah, well, so let's say you were going through an agile transformation, going into a new organization that had these sort of different, you know, silos of cultural level, going in and saying, because quite often I've heard, oh, well, agile transformation, just go in there, you start with one team, right? And then you show success with that team and everybody else will kind of follow. And I'm just wondering if you've seen or ever done that with an entire sub-organization and seen a positive influence that helps lead the cultural shift, you know, rather than sort of assuming that it is what it is.
Right. So the question of the cultural shift is simply a question of, does the leader want to shift?
Yeah, I think leaders shift because there's something in it for them, or certain parts, maybe certain leaders do that. And I kind of believe that if you had a red leader, but you had some part of the organization which was skewing more to orange or green, and that part of the organization was exhibiting better performance as a result of perhaps being yellow or green, and you had accelerated that red leader may look at that and go, whoa, actually, maybe I should embrace a bit more of that.
Right. Okay, you can do that. And the prerequisite, in my opinion, to doing that is to have a relationship with that red leader that allows you to have that conversation. because what you're telling that person is that you need to change, which is typically an extremely difficult message for anyone to hear, particularly a red leader. What they typically want to hear is a pat on the back. You're doing a great job. Let me go fix your teams for you so that you look like a hero, like you look like that other organization.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
Hey, Michael, I put it into the chat, but I was wondering, do you have any tips for when in a large organization, the very senior leadership is supportive of Agile to the point where they will actually individually go get Agile coaches to make sure that they're learning and that they understand it? But then throughout the other levels underneath that, there can be many leaders that won't say they're not supportive because they know that's not what they should be doing, but they consistently throw up roadblocks and things that make it more challenging to have Agile when working with various teams. For example, product managers that just ignore the aspect of, hey, you got to leave the team alone. Just basic tenets that are within the overall kind of manifesto that say, here are the ground rules that we're operating in. They tend to just stomp on those and they don't really care. Any tips for dealing with individuals like that, in a sense that since they're typically or often in a higher position than the Agile implementers or delivery leads, that it can be a little tricky sometimes interacting with those folks without getting them highly agitated at one?
Right. So are you one of the Agile implementers, delivery leads?
Yes.
Right. So I'm going to give you, again, a very hard message here. So this comes from work that I'm doing with Cherie Seiler. It's going to be in an upcoming book called An Invitation to Enterprise Coaching. So here's a huge trap that's similar to the trap that, Ian was discussing, right? Which is we're constantly as Agile coaches trying to do things that in some sense we are either have not been asked to do or are not authorized to do or are essentially impossible to do. So whose job is it to ask middle management to do X, Y, or Z in a hierarchical organization? Well, the answer is very simple. The answer is it's the job of top management to ask middle management to do that.
Correct. And in my situation, that has been done. The message has been put out there. We will go down the Agile path, and then they put folks such as myself in place to help the organization make that transition. But then in various parts of the organization that I've been in over the years, sometimes it's me or sometimes some of my peers, there are just certain individuals who resist it. And then you've been instructed to institute this, but you just have these resistors that make it much more challenging. But you don't want to, essentially go off and say, hey, so-and-so is just making this impossible so that you're a complainer. But it's just how to interact. Or I just didn't know if there were any tips. So I hear your point about, yeah, if it's just been a flat no, we don't want this. Yeah, you're just beating your head against the wall. But it's when the answer is it should be yes, but in other levels you get no.
Right. See, that's the thing, is that as soon as you feel uncomfortable in that spot, to me, this is like about the coaching agreement. So coaching is about being on the client's agenda. And so if your client is the middle manager, there would be no friction, right? Because you would be supporting the middle manager in doing what they want to do.
Yes.
The weird thing that's happening here is that your agenda is coming from someone who is not your client, right? Your agenda is coming from top management, but you're coaching the middle manager.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the weird, bizarre thing that's happening here. So you have to be super clear here about who your coaching agreement is with. And if the issue is between top management and middle management, then the thing to do, what we recommend, is to bring top management and middle management together with typically like some sort of formal structure that makes the misalignment super clear, or some way in which you, in a very, very objective, disinterested way, non-confrontational way, can bring in observations. Otherwise, you're constantly in like this super uncomfortable area of having to figure out how to change people's behavior who have not really signed up for the change. And you're basically having to serve these two masters, and you're being torn apart. And you're saying, I want to do what this person says, but I don't want to be mean to this person. And you're like in this completely and totally unfair situation. And so like what we do is we basically say, okay, we're not running your organization, right? We're not managers in your organization. We're coaches. We are not authorized to change any person or anything in your organization. We're coaches. We help people get more of what they want, right? If they don't want something, we don't insist that they want it. We don't push it on them. We don't do anything like that. Okay. So if you want something done, you have to give us someone or a group of people that are going to get that, right? So you're required to actually, as part of our coaching agreement, give us this group of people, this named group of people that are going to make those changes.
Okay.
And are going to work in sort of a high bandwidth way to make those changes. And so when you come across these resistors, these people who are reluctant, who are dragging their feet, then it becomes the issue of those people who are actually looking at these problems on like a daily basis or near daily basis. They're not like once a quarter top management who issue a decree and who are sort of on board. They're actually in the weeds type of people who are seeing the issues and can actually make the organizational changes. And so it's a really big upstream problem that once you're too far down the line, then you're in this really sticky spot.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and so like one of the very broad lessons and things about all of this, like this entire talk, is to always try to be again and again and again, and like in these places of like complete and total clarity and authenticity, right? So like that's why I say like these very sort of make these very large cuts in sort of the world, like if the leader is not there, like you can think of like 101 million like little strategies. Like, can we do this grassroots? Can I get a friend and can we be teal together? Yes, you can do that. And you can spend like the rest of your life pushing, you know, boulders up hills. And that is like, you're in a constant crisis, like trying to hide from the organization, being in this world where like darts are being thrown at you all of the time. And the goal is to always be like trying to be in flow, right? In harmony. Like that's what teal means, like in harmony with nature. Like you see in nature, like things are not, right? Like birds and the bees are all working together with each other, right? Like they're all in balance with each other, right? And so that's what we're trying to be. We're like trying to be in flow with life, right? And feeling the energy, like feeling good, right? Feeling good, right? And that comes from always like searching for that clarity, like, right? Not being in the muck, right? And getting out of the muck by making these really hard choices. They can be very difficult, hard choices, personal choices, professional choices, and being really clear with yourself and people about like what is actually true, what is actually going to work, and what is not going to work. And that doing that again and again and again and again, so you can get to this place that actually ultimately serves the client, and not like trying to say, well, you know, this, and then we can do that, and then we can do that, and then maybe this person, and then this, and then this, and right? Like that's where we get into the muck. is my opinion. Like the entire Agile coaching community has this sort of general problem where we spend so much time in this situation where we're in conflict, where we are not aligned, and we are, it's like too okay, in my opinion, with all of these things happening. And that's why so many Agile transformations fail. And so it's totally okay to hear a no. And then our responsibility is, oh, if no, what that means is we can only do X. So like in this example, that means that we can only do this set of practices. We're not going to be able to do a whole bunch of other practices that are really helpful for you. So you can say no. Now, if you say yes, this means that you personally need to go on a 2-year program of growth. Okay, those are your 2 choices. What you can't do is go to a 2-day training and win, right? That's the deal, right? And what we too often want to do is say, yeah, oh, actually, the 2-day training program, that's good enough, right? We're constantly saying that, right? And then we end up in big trouble, right? All right, so that's it for me. Thank you so much. Back over to you.